6 months ago, I quit my lawyer job to be a stay-at-home mom. I was a mid-level attorney at one of the largest US law firms. Before that, I got my Juris Doctor degree from Northwestern University, and before that, I was already a medical doctor in Taiwan. On the paper, it just seemed like I kept building credentials but then kept stopping halfway. For me, however, all the bizarre moves that were seemingly damaging my career or suggesting that there was something wrong with me, they were just me trying to live my life according to my will and not according to social expectations. Where if I wake up and feel miserable and unmotivated for a prolonged period of time, I'll be able to make change to it rather than to pressure myself into a way of living just to look normal to the world. And and I'm not from a wealthy or connected family. My dad is a pharmaceutical sales rep turned small business owner, and my mom is a Taiwanese teacher. So it's not like I could do whatever I want without planning, but still, I have been sticking to this principle to various degrees of success, and I've learned several lessons. In the first videos of this channel, I want to talk about how it has been for me as a regular person from a regular middle class family to attempt to live a free life. Specifically, what I've learned about making the right move. If you wake up and feel miserable and unmotivated about the day ahead and any days in the foreseeable future for a prolonged period of time, what do and how do you know if what you're contemplating is the right move? Unfortunately, I don't have a direct answer to this question yet, but I do have a few thoughts about the opposite. How to know if the move might not really solve the problem. In this episode, let's talk about one of the lessons I learned about why and how I was still unhappy after some of the moves I made. How to make the right move. Are you making a correct assessment of why you're unhappy and what it takes to make you happy? Before we dive into this topic, I want to briefly talk about two concepts that I learned from Dr. Lindsay Gibson in her book, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. These two concepts are the healing fantasy and the role self. Simply put, when a child experiences an emotional injury, to try to cope with the pain, they might consciously or subconsciously create an imaginary reality where whatever they perceive to be the cause of the pain does not exist. And they will also invent a version of themselves, which is what they think they need to act like to get to the imaginary reality where the pain does not exist. That imaginary reality is the healing fantasy, and the invented version of themselves is the role self. And the problem with this coping mechanism is that as a kid, both the healing fantasy and the role self can be impractical. And also this coping mechanism will eventually lead the person to consciously or subconsciously think that they are not worthy of love and happiness just as the way they are, but rather they have to be like the role self to be happy and worthy of love. For me, I grew up being bullied both in school and at home. The situation in school was just typical school bullying. One day, all the kids in the class decided to hate on me because my grades were too good, and the teachers decided not to do anything about it. The situation at home was more because I have a jealous and aggressive sibling, plus preoccupied parents who would punish the one who cried rather than the one who attacked. The pain in both of these situations was the sense of hopelessness, where I was being attacked for something that was not my fault, but no one would even acknowledge that or help me out of the situation. So my healing fantasy is that one day I'll get to a place where people are all reasonable, civil, and polite, and everyone respects each other's boundaries, so there won't be any aggression or conflict that I have to force myself to stomach like when I was little. And the way for me to get there, aka my role self, is to be so much above the bad apples socially, financially, such that they will never get even close to me. For example, the way I escaped the bullies was to get into the best high school for the country, which was so selective that none of the bullies was able to get in. The problem with this thinking is that there's no such place on earth where there's zero aggression or conflict. There's just no way everyone agrees on everything all the time, so there's always going to be conflict. And when people are competing against each other, aggression is just hard to avoid. It would be way more effective to learn to handle the aggression in a healthy way than to pursue a place with zero aggression and conflict. So even though the coping mechanism might have made sense to me when I was a kid, they are just not really practical or rational. But I didn't consciously know all of these things when I was making my big moves from medicine to law, and then from law to the self-discovery plus stay-at-home mom phase. If you had known me back then and asked me why, I would have given you more superficial reasons like preferring a more dynamic and impactful kind of work for the transition from medicine to law, and wanting to take care of my baby myself because I was not doing a really good job when I was pregnant. taking care of myself and him for the transition out of law. These were also honest reasons, but they were not the complete picture, and hence they invited the incomplete solutions because I was not conscious of the fact that all these years I have been viewing the world through the lens of the healing fantasy and the role self. If I found myself in an environment where I had to be encountered with enough offensive behaviors that triggered my coping mechanism, I took it as a sign that I had not got to the healing fantasy yet, and therefore had to double down on being my role self to do better than those bad apples. Because of this subconscious filter, a few individuals deviating from what I considered to be civil and polite behaviors can greatly enhance the insufferability of the situation. Also, the thinking that I needed to be my role self to get to the good place was harmful too, as I specifically remembered that the reason I chose law after medicine was because of the $200K a year starting salary as long as I could get into a big law firm. And I feel that I needed to throw that in the face of some of those people that I encountered in medicine, although later in life I obviously came up with better sounding reasons as to why I made the transition to law, even though it was just as superficial as that. And transitioning to law didn't get me to my healing fantasy because the healing fantasy doesn't really exist. And if anything, the general vibe of the legal field is a lot more confrontational and a lot less collaborative than medicine. And hence, it is probably even less of a proxy to my healing fantasy. Lastly, when I view the world through the lens of the healing fantasy and the role self, I also just tended to wishfully think that everyone that I met once I made it would be good human beings, which also got me into a bunch of bad decisions involving people who I shouldn't have trusted and interacted with in the first place. All this is to say, if I have learned anything from the past almost 15 years since I started making decisions for my life, it is that it is imperative to make sure that I'm not viewing the world through a skewed perception influenced by an impractical coping mechanism like a healing fantasy and a role self. This coping mechanism affected my ability to assess why I was unhappy, miserable, and unmotivated in a certain environment, and it affected my ability to come up with an effective solution to the problem because whenever the coping mechanism was triggered, it just automatically concluded that all the issues were a result of me not resembling my role self enough and hence not being in a place like the healing fantasy. And so the solution had to be to go on and become so much better than what I was, no matter what it takes. Even if I couldn't completely eradicate the coping mechanism from my cognition, it would be very helpful to at least be conscious of it. For example, recently I got bothered by some people in a group of law students that I mentored who kind of took my help for granted and showed no signs of understanding that what they did was wrong. I caught myself questioning whether that happened because I'm no longer in big law, that is, not resembling my role self enough to be away from the bad apples. And I also caught myself planning for my next move and thinking how I can make sure that I don't engage with people of that sort through the next move. That is, plotting my way to a healing fantasy where whatever was bothering me doesn't exist. All of that despite the fact that I'm not even close to that timing to think about the next move yet, and the fact that I've already seen for myself that chasing the benchmarks in the social hierarchy just really only made me more miserable. Because I knew the coping mechanism was kicking in and it was rendering a relatively impractical and irrational solution, I was able to focus on disengaging myself from this coping mechanism rather than plotting a plan that does not reflect or solve the problem. Whether or not you feel like you might have such a coping mechanism working in the background, and regardless of which stage you are in for the career or life in general, I recommend that you try the simple test Dr. Gibson provided in her book to find out what healing fantasy and role self you have, if any. The test is simple, just to read through some open-ended sentences and to complete the sentences with what immediately comes to your mind. The questions are on the screen right now, and I will also put it in the section below so it is easier to work on. Try them out and maybe you'll find something interesting about yourself. After all, whether you're in the high or low of your career right now, it's always helpful to know yourself better. And if you really do have such a coping mechanism running in the background, one way to disengage from the coping mechanism that worked for me is simply to use my adult brain to evaluate assumptions that I made as a kid. And I needed to repeat the rational evaluation to myself every time I sensed that the coping mechanism was kicking in. So, for example, I would say to myself, that encountering with those people doesn't mean there's anything wrong with me, or that I haven't advanced myself enough to get to a good place with good people only. There's no such place on earth. If I want to be farther away from aggression, I can be more intentional about who I choose to work with. I can learn the diplomatic way to say no in a corporate setting, and I can learn to view things from the other side to reduce the surge of intense emotions inside of me when an offense takes place. These will work to protect me and make me feel better without having to revamp my life or pursue some sort of external validation to feel that I'm unreachable by the bad apples. If I'm going to make a big change, it has to be based on a correct assessment of what is making me unhappy and what it takes to make me happy. And the answers that I got through the coping mechanism invented by a 14-year-old girl just isn't going to give me the right directions. As I've done this enough, gradually I've developed a new neural pathway that is rational and safe, and it replaces the old primitive coping mechanism, so the old one stops kicking in automatically whenever my childhood emotional injury is triggered. And so I have a better chance of evaluating a situation correctly to reflect on the issue and come up with a more rational solution so that I am actually addressing the issue. That's it for today. Thank you for watching till the end. If you completed the sentences, what did you find out about your healing fantasy and role self? Did you recall your coping mechanism ever affecting your decision making? Share it in the comments below if you don't mind. If you like this video or find it potentially helpful for any of your friends, please consider liking, subscribing, or sharing. Thank you. I hope to see you in the next episodes about making the right move.